Our Old Testament reading today is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 58. Shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And now a reading from the Gospel. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. Anybody else? Anybody remember that? Okay, since we're having so much fun singing, shall we? Jesus wants me for a sunbeam to shine for him each day. In every way try to please him, at home, at school, at play. A sunbeam, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. A sunbeam, I'll be a sunbeam for him. Thanks for the help. Okay, so some of us learned that as little children, right? And I decided to go back and look and find out where that came from, and it turns out that there is this woman named Nellie Talbot who wrote this about 1900. Now, since that time, it's had an interesting history. There's a Scottish alt-rock band called the Vaselines who have covered it, right? And then, a few years later, the grunge band Nirvana covered it with a version that they changed to "Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam." Thank you, Kurt Cobain. So Nellie Talbot probably wrote this in support of the Sunbeam Band movement. Now, this started in a Virginia Baptist church in 1886. A woman named Anna Louise Elsom was a young mother who wanted to teach little children about missions. And she prayed for a pastor to come to her church that would support her in this. And finally, a man named George Braxton Taylor came as pastor. He was the son of the earliest Southern Baptist missionaries in Italy and the nephew of the first secretary of the Foreign Mission Board. Well, this group came to be known as the Sunbeams because of the way the light came in through the window of the church and shined on this little group where she was teaching in the back corner of the church. So they called them the Sunbeams. Actually, the idea caught on and spread all through churches in America around that time until finally the ministry was passed to the Women's Missionary Union, where later the name was changed to Mission Friends. Sounding familiar? Well, since our association with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, we actually have continued to teach little children about the world and about missions and all of that. But we came to call our group the Globe Trekkers, which was a name a mother in our church came up with in concert with her pastor named George. Thank you, Kim Mason, for that name. By the way, just to tighten the loop on all of this, a former member of Wilshire went on to become the president of the Women's Missionary Union many years later, and her surviving husband is now my father-in-law, Bill O'Brien, who was also our first music minister and a vice president of the Foreign Mission Board. Go figure, right? So now, as Paul Harvey used to say, you know, don't you know, the rest of the story. So the thing is, this idea of being a sunbeam for Jesus is really related to what he says right here in the Sermon on the Mount. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine so that others may see your good works. And in doing so, give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Salt and light are actually the two gifts that we give immediately following baptism to everyone who is baptized in our church and to those who reaffirm their Christian baptism in our church. Because we understand that if Jesus is himself the light of the world, capital L, light, right, that the world needs that light to shine through those who identify themselves with him. This is the family business that we are joining, you see. We don't receive his light for ourselves alone, but for the purpose of refracting it. We don't receive the warmth of the Son of God just for ourselves, but to emit it to others, right? In other words, we don't just confess Jesus is Lord for our salvation, we bear witness that Jesus is Lord for the salvation of the world. Now, when Jesus said this to his followers, that they were the light of the world, he went on to use this little image that a city on a hill cannot be hidden. And it's interesting that that phrase has become deeply embedded in the American story. For example, John Winthrop, the Puritan preacher, used this in his sermon titled "A Model of Christian Charity" while en route to the New World on the ship Arabella. This was one of his subpoints in the sermon. He took these words of Jesus and applied them to his little Sunbeam band on that ship. He believed that if his little church would heed the prophets, like Micah, for instance, whose words we remember from last week when he said, "Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God." If they would do those things, then God would bless them and make of them a new Israel on these shores. It was a noble thought, and it has become so knit into the American story that sometimes we can't tell the difference between the church's story and America's story. That sometimes is a problem. For instance, the columnist David Brooks was just this week calling for a renewed understanding of America's mission in the world. And he borrows all sorts of language from the church. Listen to this. America, Brooks says, has a spiritual connection to all people in all places, but also an exceptional role. America culminates history. It advances a way of life and a democratic model that will provide people everywhere with dignity. The things Americans do are not for themselves only, but for all mankind. Now, I agree with Brooks that in times like these, especially in times like these, we need to remember that if we're going to call America exceptional, why we call America exceptional, okay? That it means seeing that the way we live and understand ourselves as a nation is an alternative way that most nations think of themselves. And Ronald Reagan was fond of saying that if you move to Italy to live there and become a citizen, it doesn't make you Italian. If you move to Greece, you don't automatically become Greek. And if you move to France, you're not automatically French. But if you move to America from anywhere and become a citizen of this nation, you become an American. There is a kind of welcome, of a new sort of identity that goes with this understanding. And it's something important, Brooks says, in a time when we are forgetting that now in our fear of immigrants and refugees. We need to remember it. But Baptists shortly thereafter started making the rightful case that church and state should be separated, and that images like a city set on a hill should not just be co-opted by the state, but actually these apply to the church primarily, because the church always must remain the conscience of the state. It can't become part of it so that it's indistinguishable there too. This was the phrase of Martin Luther King Jr., the church is the conscience, the moral conscience of the state. Well, Isaiah is talking about the covenant people of God rather than just a nation among nations. Whether they were exiles in Babylon or were in their homeland, whether they were in charge of their own public life or were subject to the whims of foreign powers who controlled them, the charge to them was the same: be a light to the nations. But how does Isaiah say that Israel is to be a light to the nations? Did you hear it? If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom be like the noonday. More than once in this very chapter and all through the prophet Isaiah, we hear this over and over again, phrases where whether they are to be light is tied directly to their advocacy for things like loosing the bonds of injustice, letting the oppressed go free, sharing bread with the hungry, bringing the homeless into your house, clothing the naked, caring for your kin. Then, he says, your light shall break forth like the dawn. Another prophet that we just honored today from our own church's history, Phil Strickland. He said this: the challenge Christ gives is to be his light in the culture in which we live. We are to bring light into broken homes of divorce and poverty, to bring light to the public policymakers, and to bring light to the homeless and hungry. Now, this is why our church is becoming more deeply involved in public policy. We have now a Christian advocacy specialist on our staff, Katie Murray, who works with our missions minister, Heather Mustaine. And they keep us focused on this work. Public education, homelessness, payday lending, immigration and refugees, foster care and hunger. These are just a few of the things we are doing now in our church to answer the demands of our time in being a city set on a hill, shining the light of Christ into a world of darkness. And it has taken, I tell you, some recalibration of our understanding of mission. Not that we cease to do what we did before, but that we add this understanding in these tumultuous times. Now, many of us have thought that the full extent to which we might work hard in order to be a shining light of Jesus in the world is to keep ourselves from personal sin. Be pure and clean and clear and all of that so that we can shine brightly. As one stanza of the little Sunbeam song says, I will ask Jesus to help me to keep my heart from sin, ever reflecting his goodness and always shine for him. Okay. That's right. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually the full extent of what it says, though. And do you notice how individualistic that is? Just avoid sin, and you will shine for Jesus, and you're done. But the church, I tell you, can become perfectly pure and sinless and not do any good for the world around it. In fact, Isaiah specifically calls out Israel for just that intention when he says that their personal piety with their fasts and prayers, they were doing nothing wrong. They just weren't doing anything right. That is to say, it's not enough to do nothing wrong. God calls us to do right by those who need us. And that's why all through this season of Epiphany, we've been focusing on our light work in the world. It's why our friends who were just here at the table, whose names we didn't mention but are in your order of service because of their serving in a dangerous part of the world, they have received money from this hunger offering, as you have heard, as they serve also with handicapped children who've been forsaken by their families because of the tenets of their culture. When we sent out teams a few weeks ago to help count the homeless, so not just as a number, but to notice them, to name them, and to make sure they are not forgotten. And then when we receive them, to sleep overnight in our church as a kind of sanctuary because the shelters were full, and our people came and stayed with them and ate with them. These are ways we are shining the light of Christ. When we work in this country to see to it that people of color and those of other sexual orientations or gender identity can believe that they have the same opportunity as any others to be Americans and to fulfill their God-given dignity as human beings, then we are being sunbeams for Jesus. See? That's what the church is for, after all. Yes, it's a community of Christ that practices sin prevention, but that's only in order to serve our mission. That simply gets us fit for our real purpose of being friends and neighbors and advocates for those who need greater strengthening in their lives to flourish as God intended. The money we give in this offering goes to some amazing things that do just that. And I tell you, it's not just providing meals now and then for hungry people. It's a holistic view of how to help people develop the tools and the ability to care for themselves and feed themselves for a long time. Heather described one such thing in her piece here in Preparing to Worship about a ministry in Barcelona. Then there's also the Dorcas Project, which we have been funding through this offering. The Africa Community Church is one of 7 ethnic congregations that meets just up the road at the Gaston Christian Center. Executive director being Bill O'Brien. My goodness, it keeps coming round, right? Their pastor, Seth Samisi, went back to his homeland in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and what he found were all these women who had been raped and sexually abused by radical militants, and their lives were torn apart and devastated, and their families. And so we put together money for an offering that allows them to learn how to sew and knit, gives them sewing machines, and allows them to develop their own small businesses so that they can care for their families and live productive lives. This is part of the hunger offering, you understand. And then there's the chicken and cattle farming project in northern Thailand, where our former pastoral resident, Jason Edwards, and his wife, Christy, spent 2 years serving in this area. The money goes to buy chickens and cows and pigs for people there, families, that it will help them feed up to 20 families and 80 people. Before this time, a man named Suntorn Inthayak could only barely provide food for his own family. He has a mentally disabled son, he's a menial day laborer, and they just could barely put food on the table. But now his family and these others are able to feed the entire small community in which they live ongoing without having to receive more, transforming their lives for generations. When these gifts are made, I tell you, lives are changed. And it's not just in the physical sense, but in the sense of human dignity. And when they receive them, do you know who else they are receiving? They are receiving the witness of the testimony about Jesus Christ, the one who is the light of the world. And you already heard us sing all sorts of ways of talking about him in this way. This little light of mine earlier. I don't know about you, but my favorite line in that little hymn is, hide it under a bushel. No. I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine, church. Let it shine. Amen.